What's up, everybody? Welcome back to U.S. History. Here we are continuing on with World War II, but we're really going to shift gears here and look at the war from a very different angle. We're a different vantage point here where World War II really is kind of a true world war. Like I'd said a few times in the past, World War I is kind of a big European conflict, and then there is a few small battles out in Asia and Africa, but primarily all the fighting was done in Europe. Not the case for World War II. Really, there is going to be fighting spread out across Europe, Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and even a little bit coming in close to the shores of America. For what we're doing today, or just like an overarching kind of theme for World War II, there's really, they say there's two theaters of World War II. Now, theater, you think of that like going in and watching a movie. In this case, it's just talking about like two big places where like the fighting is going down. Generally, you'll hear historians talk about it, and they'll say the European theater or the Pacific theater. If it's the European theater, you're talking about like what's going on with the Nazis and who's fighting them. And then the Pacific theater is Japan out there fighting, and a lot of the fighting is actually done in China and Korea and various islands out there. Now, America is the one country more than any other that once we actually get involved in the war, we fight a lot in both theaters of the war. We really have to make some tough decisions and decide how are we going to split up our manpower and how many guys and how much resources are we going to send to each of those theaters of the war. We'll get into that a little bit more down the road with some of those strategic decisions that our leadership had to make. Today, what we're doing is just kind of getting the backstory, kind of like when I did the intro to World War II notes, and we were talking about like they were from last week, where we were getting into like Hitler's rise to power and what had been going on in Europe, and how America played into that, which was really we didn't play into it a whole lot. Other than like when our stock market crashed and we had become the financial hub of the world, that sends ripple effects out across the world, and it affects everybody else eventually. The same is true. A lot of American policy is what, in a way, kind of pushes Japan into becoming more aggressive out in the Pacific, where America and Japan are the two big powers out in the Pacific Ocean, both on opposite sides of the ocean, and it kind of almost became inevitable by the late 1930s on into 1940 that those two countries were going to square off at some point to decide who's the toughest kid on the block. Now, Japan has a very different history from America, or even from Germany or Russia or any of the European countries that we've talked about up to this point. It makes sense. It's a different culture, a different ethnic group, very different history and different background there. A lot of times I think American history students, we can relate to what was going on in Germany. Not to say that we're Nazis or anything like that, but we're both Western countries. Yeah, we speak a different language, but a lot of our culture, and it really doesn't matter what race you are here in America, if you were born and raised in America, you kind of have grown up in a Western or Europeanized culture. So in a lot of ways, what was going on in Germany, we can kind of relate to. And our political system was similar. Like Hitler got democratically elected to power, and we can kind of that makes sense to us a lot of times more so than what was going on out in the Pacific, because Japan they have a totally different culture, background, and history. Just everything playing into what was going on in the Pacific. Americans often have a really big disconnect and have a hard time kind of relating to and understanding or getting inside the mind of the average Japanese person or their leadership or Japanese soldiers. And I'll explain what I mean by that a lot more as the unit unfolds. So for today, as we're starting up here, you really have an option for where you're going to put these notes. You could continue them on the page that we already had started. If you do that, I would draw a big line and have a break, and then I would put something about Japan or even war in the Pacific or something like that, Pacific theater of the war, so you know that we're talking about a different part of the war. And like I said, America is going to fight in both fronts, but Japan and Germany, even though they're going to be in the same alliance together, they really almost have hardly any contact with each other, and they don't really support each other. It was just that they were in an alliance of convenience, that they both had the same enemies. They both saw America and Russia and Great Britain as their enemies. So kind of by default, they fall into an alliance together. So your first option is, though, I'm kind of getting off on a tangent there. You can continue it on the page of notes you had already started, or it wouldn't be a bad idea to start up a fresh new page of notes. And then you could actually have 2 pages of notes that you're working out of. One is kind of like fighting the Nazis in the European theater of the war, and the other would be the Pacific and fighting Imperial Japan. So, you can bounce back and forth. Basically, on most of the quizzes, I will keep them separate. You won't have questions about Germany and Japan in both theaters of the war on the same quizzes. I kind of keep them divided, and I think that helps to make sense in freshman or sophomore history students' brains if I keep those divided that way. So really kind of the rest of this week, we're going to be getting into what was going on out in the Pacific. So have your page of notes out handy and have your new title like Japan Builds an Empire, or another thing you could put in there would be like the Pacific Theater of the War. And here we'll get going. All right, so moving on, giving you a really quick rundown of Japanese history and just some of the highlights that I've chosen to put in there to help you understand the history of Japan and their culture and the mindset of the Japanese people. Because like I said, it's very different from like the American history or our mindset, or really that of any European country. Now, you could spend a year, you could spend multiple years and read books and books about like the history of Japan. It is a country with a very rich culture and history of its own, but this is an American history class, so I can't dig too deep into this because we could end up spending the rest of the semester just talking about Japan, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. I just want to give it to you in kind of a nutshell, a quick rundown. Now, you don't have to write down every single thing on this slide, but it would be good to know this. So you might want to jot some of these down where you just put in little, short bullet points or tidbits that'll help trigger your memory down the road. So starting off at the top and then just kind of working down my list. Japan has been around for a long time. They're a chain of islands. So and this might be something you'd want to jot into your notes too. Japan is not one island. It's actually a chain of islands. There's 4 big islands and then about 1,000 other tiny little islands that make up what is the modern day country of Japan. It's had its own separate culture and been kind of separate from other Oriental or Asian cultures for roughly about 2,600 years. So that goes back a long time ago. I think that's about like 600 years before Jesus was born, to give you kind of a milestone that would make sense to a lot of people in the West. So it's been an independent nation for a long time. It makes sense too, because where China was the dominant force in the Orient, in that eastern part of Asia, China had really dominated most of the countries around there. Japan was a little bit protected. Kind of think of it like how England is a little bit protected from like Nazi Germany during World War II, because they're their own separate island, and the German armies and their armored divisions can't get out there to conquer Britain. They can't cross the water. The same has been true for Japan for a lot of its history, where that water barrier had protected it from getting overrun by China many times, because China is a country that's been around for millennia too, every bit as old, and actually quite a bit older than Japan. And there's a lot of times throughout history where China was eyeing Japan down and they wanted to go take them over. But the problem for them was they couldn't. It was really hard to move armies, especially in like prehistoric or ancient times, to move them across bodies of water. So Japan had always been kind of independent. Now they're an Oriental culture, and their language and religion, that it's really very different from that of like Western or Europeans, where we like think about it like Germany, France, England, or America. We all use like essentially the same alphabet, and our languages work the same way. Well, I think Japan is influenced by China, although they are independent. They have their own separate language, but they still use that like pictogram style language where you have to memorize lots of different like characters and little pictograms, where they, you've probably seen some Japanese or Chinese writing in the past. So anyway, They're similar culture, so in some ways to China, but also very different. And they've always wanted to be independent, and they've always resisted like outsiders coming in and telling them what to do. They're a fiercely independent people. So that's something that you could put in your notes too. That would be a good little tidbit to have, that they're fiercely independent and they have a long tradition of that. So Japan had really closed its borders off for a long, long time, for most of history. And, they have a lot of internal struggles going on there, where you can read, like, there are some awesome novels and stories about, like, the samurai warriors and these different warlords or shoguns, like, fighting each other in Japan for control of the islands. A lot of fighting, a lot of warfare internally, but they hadn't had to deal with outsiders all that much, because they have had a long-standing policy, like for hundreds of years, that any outsiders that show up on the islands, like the imperial leadership had said, you basically go down to the beach, you see somebody landing there, and you scare them off, or you chop their heads off, and we don't want any outsiders coming in and polluting our culture. They looked at themselves as very pure, and the outsiders are like the barbarians or heathens, and that outsiders could be Korean or Chinese people, but it also could be Western Europeans, white guys showing up and trying to trade with them or tell them what to do. So Japan had closed borders for a very long time. They had isolated themselves from the rest of the world for hundreds and hundreds of years. That had kind of been the policy there. Well, think of it, by the time you get to 1853, so my second bullet point here, the world is starting to modernize. That's when the Industrial Revolution has started to take off, right? In America, we're starting to build trains, and you know what I mean? Like, the very first automobiles are starting to come out. Now, they haven't been mass produced yet, but we have electricity and a lot of new technology. I think that's getting close to the time of the Civil War. So now you have soldiers aren't using spears and swords on the battlefield, or at least not that much. Now they're using rifles. They're using pistols, with like revolvers, where it carries multiple shots in it. Well, Japan had been so isolated for such a long period of time. They had fallen way behind technologically, but they didn't really realize it, because anytime somebody would come up and try to trade with them, they would usually shut it down right away and say, no, not interested, get the heck off of our islands. Anyway, there are quite a few horrific stories of like missionaries like having a boat wreck and getting washed up on the shore of Japan, and then like some samurai warriors coming down and decapitating them right on the beach, and then like putting their bodies out and sending a really strong message. You don't want to mess with us, stay out of here. Well, by 1853, that's a little bit before the American Civil War, America is starting to become a more powerful country. Our problem is, like, we have good factories and we're ready, and a lot of good businessmen here that are looking to make a profit and really expand our economy. But the problem for America was, at that time, most of the places around the world had been already spoken for by one European power or another. This is the age of colonialism and imperialism, where there are a lot of big empires in the world, but basically all of them were coming out of Europe. Europe had a technological explosion with the Industrial Revolution, and they had used that to their advantage. So basically all the continent of Africa are colonies at this point, and owned by one European country or another. Huge chunks of Asia are also part of these European empires, like the British controlled India. They also had taken Australia. The French had come in, and they had taken what they called French Indochina, which is like modern day Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. So America feels kind of behind. On the one hand, we have that split personality where we feel like everybody should have independence and freedom. On the other hand, we also want to make money. We want to have business. We want to be a powerful country. So we're kind of eyeballing places around the world where we could go trade and start making profit. Maybe not directly looking to conquer them, but we want markets open for American goods to be sold. Now, most places have been spoken for, but one of the few places left on the global map that wasn't spoken for, or in one empire or another, was Japan. It had maintained its independence, and nobody had been able to go in and conquer it yet. So an American fleet of fairly modern, like iron battleships with for the time, very modern cannons and a lot of firepower actually goes into Tokyo Harbor. under this Commodore Perry. So it was a Commodore is like a captain that controls a like small fleet of ships. And he goes in and he asks for a meeting with the emperor and the shogun. The guys that are, the shogun is like the military leader, like the top general. And then the emperor is like the actual top, like the head, peak, the top of the pyramid for Japanese culture. And they say, hey, we want to start trading with you guys. Basically, the Japanese leadership says, thanks for the offer, but no thanks. And then Commodore Perry says, well, before you kick us out of here and tell us to go back across the Pacific Ocean, we want to show you a few things first. And out in the harbor, they had taken some old like Japanese wooden ships because they still are using wood boats at the time. And they have one of the modern American battleships, get its cannons all ready, and they blast this ship to smithereens, just blow it to splinters out in the harbor. This freaks out the shogun, the emperor, and all the Japanese leadership. They're like, what the heck was that you just used? Now, they know guns exist, but they've never really seen that firepower up close and firsthand. They realize right away that, oh man, if these Americans or any of these European barbarians, if they show up on our shores with these weapons in mass, we're going to be in big trouble because we're still fighting with samurai swords and they're going to be able to kill us from a long distance. So this freaks out Japan. And Japan decides, they make a strategic change where they're not necessarily going to open up all their borders, but they do agree to start trading with America. They want some of that new technology. So actually, America and Japan kind of create a close bond, in those early years in the mid 1800s. And Japan wants to westernize its country very quickly or build its military up on a European model. Not many other countries around the world outside of Europe or America had done that. Japan is one of the only ones that does, and they're very successful at it. They have a disciplined culture, great workforce, and in a lot of ways, they're able to build up an army in Japan on this European model that really would rival almost any European army out on the battlefield or out on the high seas in like a naval battle. So they progress very rapidly. So from 1853 on, so you could put from like 1853 and maybe make a little note in there for the next about 30 years, Japan industrializes very rapidly, probably more rapidly at a quicker pace than any other country had in world history. By the time you get to the late 1800s or early 1900s, kind of where we had picked up at in like the Teddy Roosevelt era, Japan has a very first-rate military. Like I said, they could rival most of the other European countries out there. However, the racism of the day was still very intense, so they still got looked down at all the time. Nobody really respected them because they weren't white. They weren't European. They were seen as, maybe they're tough by Asian or African standards, but they're not a European white country. So a lot of racism does play into that. However, some people are going to have some rude awakenings here as Japan thrusts itself out onto the world stage. Now, another little stat I want you to put up in here. I didn't write it on here, but by the time you get to about 1900 or so on, maybe even a little past that, like by the World War I era, I want you to know that Japan has the third best Navy in the world in terms of numbers and maybe the best Navy in terms of quality of ships. Now, Great Britain back in this era had the biggest Navy. America was a close number 2. And then Japan was number 3. And actually, they had signed some treaties that didn't allow them to build as many ships as Great Britain or America. And because of that, they decided, well, since we can't have the biggest Navy because we've entered into some of these treaties, we're going to have the best ships. So actually, they, like going into World War II, they had the best battleships in the world, a couple of them. And then they also had developed some really good high-quality aircraft carriers. So Japan is really stepping it up. They industrialize very quickly. And then I'm blocking this bottom point here. They also were involved in World War I. If you remember back, I had mentioned that, like when Germany gets defeated, there were 5 countries that were in the room when the Treaty of Versailles was getting forced on Germany. You had the big allied powers that we had talked about. So like Great Britain, France, Italy, and America were all there, all essentially white guys, right? All European-based nations. And then you also had the other one in there was Japan. Now, the Japanese representatives there. Their ambassador looks different, obviously. They're Japanese people. They're Asian. They speak a different language. Like everybody else in the room spoke English and French. The Japanese guy didn't speak it that well. And even though Japan had been, my apologies for the bell going off there, even though Japan had been one of the allied powers in World War I, they wanted to be respected by the main powerful countries of the world, basically Great Britain, France, and America. During the treaty process, they put the Japanese guys over in the corner. They never really asked them their opinion. They gave them almost no respect or anything. And here's the thing. Japan has, and this is a hard thing for a lot of people to wrap their head around, has like an honor culture. And they realized after that experience in World War I that, hey, we fought with the Allies, and then afterwards, we got no respect from them. And they kind of switched their mindset in between World War I and World War II, and they say, hey, if the Allies, if the main powers of the world aren't going to respect us if we fight on their side, well, then maybe we're going to have to fight against them and go earn that respect on the battlefield. So probably a big mistake made by the Allies there. History may have played out quite a bit differently if we had just been a little bit more courteous and respectful to the Japanese during the negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles that was ending World War I. But that wasn't the way it played out. So they left that meeting really pissed off and mad, and they felt like they had something to prove, like they kind of had a chip on their shoulder. All right. One more slide for today, and then I'm going to take a break, and we'll come back and wrap these up tomorrow. Hey, we talked about the war breaking out in the different theaters of the war. And I told you in the first chunk of notes last week that if you look at an American history book, it's going to tell you World War II began on September 1st of 1939. That was the day the Germans invaded Poland. And when they did that, they had pushed and pushed and pushed far enough. And now the British and French declare war on Germany. So we mark that as the start point of World War I from a Western or a European perspective. But if you're an Asian person, if you're an Oriental person, if you grew up in China or Korea or Japan, they really look at it like the war had been going for quite a while before that. Generally, in like an Asian textbook, they'll mark the beginning of World War II as back in 1937, because that was when Japan had invaded China, invaded Manchuria, the part where the most Chinese people live, the most densely populated part of the country. And as the Japanese had gone in and started conquering China, they were absolutely horrific in their treatment of these people. We can get into this a little bit more down the road, and I will get into it some more like later this week or next week, but it'll make your blood boil and your toes curl, man. Everybody knows stories about how the Germans were ruthless and how they treated the Jews really bad. But the Japanese, they treat everybody bad that is their enemy on the battlefield. They have very much a culture and a kind of an ideology that they are racially superior to other groups. They look at any outsiders as kind of heathens and barbarians. And they're an honor culture, which is a big thing too. And they think everything is about honor, honoring your family, honoring your father, honoring the emperor who's at the top of the totem pole in Japan. So like if you are a soldier fighting against Japan and you end up surrendering, like they think that the most dishonorable thing you could ever do would be to surrender on the battlefield and not fight to the death. They feel like, when they're fighting the Americans or the British or the Russians, that, if you had any honor, if you had any respect at all, you would fight to the death on the battlefield. You'd never surrender. Now, Germany, even though Hitler will tell the Germans that they have to fight to the death, when things become hopeless at the end of World War II in like 1945, a lot of Germans they don't care that Hitler's telling them to fight to the death. They surrender and they were going to live another day. And like, hey, the regime's falling, but life goes on. They kind of have that attitude. I think that's an attitude that most people in America would kind of have. Japan's not like that. When the emperor, towards the end of the war, gives the order that you're going to fight to the death, they absolutely do this, and it's shocking to the Americans. Also, Americans that surrendered to Japan earlier on in the war, they're treated just horrifically, and we're going to get into that a lot more this next week. So anyway, different start dates for the beginning of World War II, and actually from an American perspective, a lot of Americans feel like World War II doesn't really begin until we get into it, which is when Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. We're going to come up on that pretty quick, but I think, just like in World War I, America stayed out of this war. We felt like it's not our problem. The Depression is still going on. We're focusing on our problems here at home, and the war has been going on for several years by the time America gets involved in it. But know that, if you're looking at it from the Japanese perspective or the Chinese or Korean perspective, they would say it actually began a few years before the war began with the Nazis in Europe. So about 1937 they would mark as their start date. Now, this is something that I had mentioned last week. If you don't have this in your notes, this bottom part of the slide, I'd strongly recommend you put that in there. World War II, probably more so than any other war before or since that I can think of, is a war of ideologies. All of these different countries, all the different leaders that you're profiling on that project assignment that I had just given you yesterday, all these countries are very ideological, and their leaders really subscribe to these ideologies. So really that's what's happening. You have these very different ideologies that are playing out and have taken hold in different countries, and it is a war of ideologies. Like what system is going to be the main dominant system in the world moving ahead? You have the fascists, so Germany and Italy, and Japan too. Those are all fascist states. Those are going to be the Axis powers. So Germany, Japan, Italy. I left Italy out of there. They're fascist states where everybody in society is supposed to be trying to achieve the goals of that leader group. You have communism. That's the Soviet Union, which is the largest country on planet Earth at this time. This massive country that goes all from Europe through the north of Asia. That is a communist state and has been since like the end of World War I. So they're also very ruthless. If you remember last week, I talked about how fascists and communists a lot of times really look the same to us, even though if you look at it on like a political spectrum, they're supposed to be polar opposites of each other. When you get so far extreme, it's almost like a circle. They come around and then they start behaving the same way. So from an American perspective, the fascist and the communist states, they both look rotten. They both treat their people horribly. Anyway, and then you have these capitalist democracies. So America, Great Britain, we are capitalist countries where we have a free market. You can go start your own business and make money and have your own corporation. And we're a democracy, or a republic, you could say, at the same time, where we're not technically a direct democracy, although that's the word that's most common used. We're actually republics, where we elect a representative to go make decisions on our behalf. All right, threw a lot of stuff at you. Tomorrow we'll wrap everything up, and I'll finish up the war in the Pacific notes. Hopefully this made sense to you. If there's anything that you're unclear about, by all means, shoot me an email, get in contact with me, and I'll help you out and give you some clarification.